So I want to respond to Silver Soul 7, who pointed out what seemed to be like a contradiction in my way of thinking about consciousness, because I suggested that uh, one could interpret modern neuroscience as suggesting that the brain is some sort of a receiver of consciousness. Consciousness is non-locally broadcast, you could say, permeating all space and time, and the brain, the nervous system, dips into this field uh, and picks up on a certain frequency, which then gets translated into human behavior and experienced as a particular sort of organization, biological organization or incarnation, expressing this consciousness. So there's one consciousness then, right? And every organic being, every actual entity taps into this field of unified consciousness and expresses that unity in a unique way, depending on its biological organization, depending on its autopoietic uh, structures, its autopoietic processes, which are unique in every case. Every human being, I mean, we all belong to the same species, and so we can structurally couple in a more intense way, in a more immediate way, in a more direct way than we can with other organisms. But um, we're also coupled to our bodies, our sensory motor experience, and to the world. Um, and autopoiesis is important to remember as a foundational principle in biology. But I also think that if we're ultimately going to try to account for consciousness, I don't think we can do it with an activism. We can narrow the explanatory gap, but we can't really account for consciousness. To account for consciousness, I think, is to do something more metaphysical. And activism is a kind of science. It's a phenomenology. It deals with what shows itself. Whereas I think to try to understand consciousness, you're dealing with a phenomenon, sure, but also with a noumenon. Um, and so, when we're dealing with someone like Descartes, he is exploring thinking. And thinking is a very special kind of activity. Um, it seems that when you think, you can convince yourself pretty thoroughly that you don't need a body to think. You don't need sensory experience. That you can, it seems, have thoughts which are sense free, completely pure. And certainly mathematicians seem to be quite capable of this. Uh, Thinking is, in some sense, able to reach beyond the body, and so is disembodied. Uh, that's why it's alienating, and that the Cartesian paradigm has produced, or at least made possible, in a psychological way, industrialism and the technological uh, revolution. Um, is a fact is based on the fact that it is an alienating way of bringing forth a world, but thinking has this power, and so I don't think an activism is necessarily an attempt um, to overshadow or um, dispute or to refute what Descartes had to say. Rather, they're talking about different attitudes toward reality. Descartes was trying to understand his own thinking. The inactive paradigm in cognitive science is an attempt to understand thinking in general. Descartes was doing a more personal meditation, I think, Not that he didn't mean it to be true of every other person, every other individual, but inactivism still remains on the level of general truths, whereas the personal meditation and reflection upon one's own identity that Descartes was undertaking is something else entirely. And really, when we're talking about consciousness, it's this issue. It's an issue that's so close to our own being, and in fact is identical to our own being, that we can't. I mean, inactivism is great as a science, but at a certain point, science is concerned with general truths, can no longer help you with your own particular case, your own concrete existence as an individual who experiences the world from the inside out as a thinker, as a feeler, as one endowed with some degree of will. Consciousness is that, or at least the mystery of which you are, that you are, and out of which you emerge as a thinking, feeling, willing identity. That's what you study when you study consciousness. And inactivism and neurophenomenology, I think, are one wing of the mansion that needs to be erected as both a church and a research facility for consciousness. But it's not the only way of approaching the issue. I think the sort of methodology that Descartes was using was continued by Kant and by Husserl and Hegel before Husserl and Heidegger after Husserl. They were all responding to what Descartes began and undertook for the first time. And really, he wasn't the first one. I mean, St. Augustine has his own sort of cogito. The Old Testament, Moses' encounter with Yahweh on Mount Sinai has its own sort of cogito. The name of God, I am that I am. This is a kind of cogito, or I think an intimation of the same archetype of the self trying to come through into human consciousness. And I think in some way studying consciousness will always be autobiographical. And also, autobiography is intersubjective to its very core, so consciousness is also a phenomenon that needs to be studied with others. Others who aren't just phenomena, but others who are noumenal, like us. Other eyes. And so in that sense, we would never be able to explain consciousness. That would be like explaining another human being, another eye. And we'll never have that sort of epistemological closure on consciousness. There will always be a sort of mysterious element to it, because you are it. And if you could actually finally uncover who or what you really are, you would cease to be. There'd be no more mouth to speak or ears to hear. Which I guess, at the level of this field of consciousness, that's what there is, or what there isn't. And the reason consciousness needs to incarnate and take on bodily forms, that's the only way it can experience itself. So pure spirit, pure consciousness is just empty. Form is required before experience erupts into being or into becoming. But I hope that makes some sense, Jonathan, and clears up the confusion.